There's probably not. There's been a lot of studies looking to see if you can get new neurons growing in other parts of the brain, and no one has ever seen new neurons growing anywhere else in the brain. What we think is happening is that what you do see, like when you take animals and you put them through mazes and teach them new things, that you can see changes in the MRI similar to what we've seen. And usually what happens is that neurons, each neuron has many terminals and branches at the end, so it can talk to thousands of cells. And the number of connections it has to other cells can grow and shrink quite a bit. And so we think that that is what we're seeing, is that we're seeing changes in the number of connections between neurons. The other thing that might be happening is that there's a lot of helper cells around the neurons. And those helper cells, they provide nutrients and waste materials. And again, those can come in MRI. They look like gray matter, even though they're not neurons, but they look like increased gray matter. And so it could also be that we're getting changes in the amount of those helper cells in these other brain regions, potentially also here as well. The last thing we found was a decrease in the amygdala. And again, the amygdala is that fight or flight part of the brain, right? And the part that, you're walking in the woods and you see something on the corner of your eyes and you think it's a snake. So that's your amygdala. And what was interesting was that the change in the amygdala correlated with the change in stress. And we thought this was really important because, stress is completely subjective. Like, we didn't measure cortisol in this first study. So all we had were people saying, I feel less stressed or I feel more stressed. And we used a validated questionnaire, but it's still a questionnaire. But this really suggests that it's not just self-report, right? That there's a biological reason why they're saying that they're feeling less stressed. The other thing that's really cool is that the amygdala is actually pretty large. You're actually getting, this whole thing is the amygdala, this whole gray blob. And we're just getting one single part. And in animal studies, the analogous part of the amygdala has been shown to also be responsive to stress. And specifically, so these are studies, they were done in rats, but I'm using Mickey, so sorry for those of you who like Mickey, right? So what they did is they took rats and they measured their amygdala, and the rats were just in normal cages. They then put them through a 10-day stress protocol where they restrained them so they couldn't move, and rats don't like that, right? It stresses them out. And at the end of the 10 days, they measured, and their amygdala, that same part of their amygdala had gotten much bigger and more dense. But then something curious happened. They then put them back in their original cage, and they stopped stressing them out, right? So then they went back to their normal environment, but yet the density remained high, right? Their amygdala remained large. And animals, normally if you put a rat in a big empty space, they go and they explore it, and but when they're stressed out, they don't. They just stay in one place, and they don't like to explore. And that's what these animals were doing. So even though it had been 3 weeks since they'd been stressed out, they were still acting like they were stressed out, right? In a maze, they didn't explore. And so this is the exact opposite of what we're seeing with our humans, right? So with the humans, nothing about their environment had changed, right? So they still had their stressful jobs. All the annoying people in their lives are still being annoying. But yet, right? But yet their amygdala changed, and their feelings about things changed. And so in both cases, what we're seeing is that it's not the environment, it's your relationship to your environment. And this is really important because, our lives don't change, right? Lots of times people think, oh, stress reduction means changing your life. And no, it really doesn't. It's really about changing your attitude about what's going on around you. And this is really what this is showing. Okay. So now, I'm going to show you a couple more studies. So that's the end of my data. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of data from some other people. So this is done out at Stanford. This is people with social anxiety. So the dark line is before MBSR. And what they did is they put people in the scanner. And before they put them in the scanner, they had them tell about unpleasant social situation that they had experienced. And then while they're in the scanner, they listen to a short script about that, about going to the bar and having to meet all these new people, or having to get up and give a talk, right? And so before MBSR, what you see is as they're listening to this, they get a really, really big burst of activity in their amygdala that stays up for quite a while, and then very slowly comes down after they okay, breathe it out, relax, let it go. After MBSR, there's still a spike of activity in their amygdala, but it's much shorter, right? And they very quickly recover and come back down, right? And this is significantly different between these two. And that's consistent with what people are told in MBSR and with meditation, is that, okay, you're going to have these feelings come up, but can you just let go of it? Can you just feel it and let it go, and don't keep ruminating about it, right? So let the thoughts go. And so we can see really nicely here that it's exactly what the amygdala is doing. There's also a study, this is done up in Toronto, with people with chronic depression. And they did a sadness induction. So again, they had them listen to a short script about something sad. And they told the people, as you listen to this, just feel. What does it feel like to be sad as you listen to this? And most people, if you say, what does sadness feel like? Right? Most people say something like, well, sadness is like, crying, right? And feeling kind of blue. What does that actually mean? Like, what does blue feel like, right? So, and this, crying, okay, so those are very cognitive answers. Versus, after going through MBSR, people tend to answer that question like, well, sadness, well, it feels like caved in chest and heaviness and, tears actually, the wetness going down my cheeks, right? That's what it actually feels like. And what we see here is that the brain activity is consistent with this. So the bottom is the people, the controls, and these are language areas and cognitive elaboration areas, sort of. And so, when they're doing this task, they're giving, when they ask them afterwards to describe what they were thinking of when they were in the scanner, they gave those more cognitive answers, right? Of, okay, well, it's, sad. Versus the top is the MBSR, right? And so this is your insula, and then this is another, the subgenual, you get one of these more emotional, visceral areas. And again, and these people are giving more okay, it feels heavy and collapsed chest. So the brain activity is consistent with the verbal reports. And in particular, what was kind of cool was the activity here in the insula was correlated with depression scores. So the more activity you had in the insula, so the more feeling you were able to do, the lower your depression scores, versus the less activity you had, the higher depression scores. So this is, again, it's consistent with this idea that your ability to let go of the cognitive aspect and really get into the feeling it has clinical implications, good clinical implications in this case. And then I'm going to skip that out of time. Okay, one more. Okay, so I told you attention. There's been several really good studies with attention. This first one, I love it. It was actually done at UPenn. So, UPenn undergrads are pretty good at paying attention, but what happens, they went through a class. It was like just a semester-long class where they learned all about the science of meditation, but they also, I call it MBSR, but it's not quite. They actually were told for their homework, part of their homework was to actually practice every day. And the person who gave the class is someone who does a lot of attention research. And so she gave them a standard attention test before and after this program. And what she saw is that their ability to pay attention and ignore distractors increased from before to after the semester. And then this last one I'm going to show you a bit more. This is actually done in the scanner, looking at brain structure. And these are long-term Zen practitioners, and he had them do a standard computerized task of attention and reaction times. And what he found is that, and again, so this is, first start with reaction time. So these are the controls, these are the meditators. So as we get older, in addition to getting our brain shrinking, right, we slow down, right? We all know that. And so this is the reaction times getting longer, so getting slower as the controls got older. The Zen practitioners, as they get older, they actually got faster with this reaction time test. And then looking at their volume of their putamen, which the putamen is a part of the brain area that is involved in motor control. So the controls, they're shrinking with age, right? Just like we saw in front of the brain. But in this case, it looks like that it's actually getting larger, right? So it may actually be that it's not just slowing down, but it may actually be increasing brain gray matter with practice. And his subjects, I think, were much more, had a lot more practice than the people in my study. So that may be why he's actually seeing a reversal of age effects. And then when you put it all together, you see very nicely that there's a really nice correlation between the brain volume and the reaction time. So again, it really does suggest it's due to the brain and not just to random, these people are faster or something like that. It has a biological basis. Okay, so my one last slide is the study. I love this study, right? So this is a double-blind study. It's hard to do double-blind studies on anything other than pills, right? So what this was done in an inpatient psychiatric hospital in Europe. And the person who's in charge of training the therapists there, he happened to practice Zen. And he said, I think it'd be really cool if you guys learned how to practice meditation. There's a few too many of you. I only want to do some of you at once. So U9, there's 18 of them. U9, I'm going to teach you how to practice in June, and then I'll teach the rest of you in July. No one knew there was a study going on, right? And so the therapists in training did not they learned how to meditate, but that was it, right? They continued giving standard treatment. So none of the patients were meditating, and they weren't doing anything fancy or funny. They just giving standard treatment. But then all of the patients, just as normal part of treatment, they're given periodically something called the SCL-90, which is the symptom checklist 90, which is just basically a bunch of common symptoms that psychiatric patients experience. And what they found is that the patients of the therapists who were trained in Zen had better outcome than the patients of the therapists, the control therapists, right? And this is for 7 of the 9 subscales of the SCL-90. And there's about 60 patients in each group. So what we see here is that in addition to reducing your own stress and making you feel better, that when we meditate, we actually have a big impact on the people around us, right? So it's not just about us. So with that, so the main take-home message is meditation can literally change your brain. And with that, I'll take some questions. So thank you. All right. So, and it's 25 after. So if anyone has to leave, please, that's fine. It's, go if you need to go. So.
So you said at that point we hadn't looked at cortisol, and you've looked at. Have you since looked at cortisol?
We're doing it right now. We're looking at that now. I suspect there's going to be more to it than cortisol. There have been a bunch of studies. I mean, a lot of people have shown that meditation reduces cortisol. That's pretty well standard. Mm-hmm. Also, IL-6 and some of the other stress hormones also seem to go down. But there's probably more to it than just cortisol. And we know that there's more to it than just cortisol. So, but yeah. Uh-huh.
Your last study that showed the change in reaction time, was that the same individuals over time, or just looking at
one time. Yeah, they were just looking at different age groups. Yep, and that was just not me. That's someone down at Georgia. But yeah.
Can you say something more about the amount of time that one
practice?
Has to practice?
Right. Every moment of every day. So there hasn't been any really good studies yet. I showed you the one showing that just more practice time seemed to, and there's been some studies. So the proper study hasn't been done yet, but a lot of people have done something similar where they've asked about practice time. Some people have found that you can get symptom reduction with as little as 5 to 10 minutes a day of practice. Other studies have said you need to practice the full 30 to 40 minutes a day, but you can get away with only doing it 3 or 4 times a week. You don't have to practice every day. So it may be that it depends on the patient population or which symptoms you are looking at. But again, it hasn't been done systematically yet, so we don't know. But again, subjectively, talking to people, it's sort of like exercise, physical exercise. Like sort of the more you do, the better it is. And there probably is some threshold, but, and it also may vary. Like you may only need 20 minutes and I may need 30 minutes, but, we don't really know yet. So, yeah. Yeah, other questions?
For the social anxiety study, did the amygdala activate faster in the MBSR people as well?
It did, yes. And so, but the idea of that is that often it's like, oh God, okay. So it's like there's and so whereas the idea is that you just let whatever happen, and there's less resistance to things. And so again, that may be why it's coming up faster, is because there's less resistance. Yeah, but again, small study needs to be replicated, needs more done. Yeah. Yeah.
In your studies, you mentioned that you saw increased density in the cerebellum. You touched on that you thought it might be balanced, like an increased density in the yoga. Is there any other reasons why any other hypotheses might have about why that area got more dense?
No, that's pretty early thought.
What was the question?
So the cerebellum. So does the cerebellum do anything other than balance? Or why the cerebellum might be changed other than balance from yoga? Do you know? Do you have ideas? No? Okay. You know more than I do. So.
There are a couple of neuropsychologists, like Kozial with a K, Korizal, and Deborah Budding, and they wrote a book saying, that we psychologists have been too corticocentric.
Yeah.
We haven't paid very much attention to the subcortical areas. But he makes a really good argument. It's really a compelling book. About the basal ganglia and the cerebellum and the role that they play in attention, and that just as has sort of a gating effect on on balance and fine motor seems to play a similar. It seems to have a similar gating on language. You can
Yeah.
Causes sort of a
Right.
language, and that it's thought to have that kind of gating control on thought.
Okay.
So there may be reason and balance,
Right.
and it may have to do with those things.
So I don't know if did anyone hear that? No. Okay. So the question was, so the cerebellum has been shown to do a lot of different things, right? It's often referred to as a little brain, right? And so, and one thing that it does is that in addition to gating timing control of motor function, it also does timing and control of, say, language and other cognitive functions. And so, so yes. And so, but I believe again, neuroimaging, the spatial resolution. But as far as we can tell, it seems to be more in the motor area as opposed to more the language area. I think the language area is a little bit more, was in a different part of the cerebellum. That's the short answer. So, but that doesn't mean, so one thing to get into is that what we can measure with MRI is actually pretty crude. So likely there's all sorts of things that are happening that we're not detecting, right? We know there's all sorts of things that are happening that we can't detect. But, so it could very well be that other things like that are also being impacted. But, we can't do this. Just not yet. Yeah. A question back there?
Do you know if there's any correlation between the effectiveness of meditation and the time of day that you practice?
So the question is about the time of day and effectiveness. So some people practice in the morning, some people practice at night. I don't think there's ever been a study that's looked at that specifically, and I think at this point it's probably, when you can fit it into your life and when you're more likely to practice and when it feels good for you is probably more important than. Because I know, so the yoga traditions, they talk about 4 a.m. is when the energy of the universe. And so my thing about that is like, so that's in India, but 4 a.m. in India is not the same, so it's the energy of the universe. Yeah, and also, the universe happens to have the same period, as the Earth. I find that hard to believe. So, but it is really well known that if you have a normal sleep cycle, that 4 a.m. and 4 p.m. is when you switch balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic. And so it's really interesting. That's why often you get the munchies at 4 o'clock, and the sort of 4 p.m. and your 5 o'clock shadow, all that sort of stuff. There's that switch. Also, like if you have a cold, usually you feel great all day, and all of a sudden 4 o'clock, so all that's around that. So, so probably something at 4 a.m. And that's some of that. Also, the 4 a.m. is like the time you're most likely to get a heart attack is at 4 because you're getting the switch. And also because it's Monday mornings, when you first wake up, because you've been relaxed all weekend, and all of a sudden of getting up Monday morning, and so little tidbits of information. So yeah. Yeah.
Work on meditation practices and sleep disorders relative to learning capabilities?
Not the three together. So the question's about sleep disorders. It's only been, as far as I know, it's insomnia. It seems to be good for helping insomnia. But I don't know that research. I had the list because I've seen, but I can't tell you the details of that study. Interestingly, there's been one study where they actually looked at sleep waves, like EEG patterns during sleep. And if you go by the EEG patterns, it actually looks like they're sleeping less well. But when you talk to them, they say, "Oh yeah, it's the best sleep I ever had." But so it's really interesting what's going on there. So clearly, it's having impact on sleep, but it's not really clear what it's doing to sleep. So, but I also know, and it hasn't been published yet. There's also a study. There's some people who do like really cool stuff with EEG and consciousness, and this is up at Wisconsin. This is Tononi's group, and I don't know the results, but I've heard sort of through the grapevines that they're on sleep as well, but I don't know the details. So, yeah. And okay. All right.
Can you talk a little bit about the studies that I think there's been studies done that have looked at how with meditation you can block out stimuli that is like unimportant?
Right.
Yeah.
That's the study that's actually the study done at UPenn with the undergrads. So what she did is you get shown a whole bunch of faces and you're told, try to remember these faces, right? And then you either see a whole bunch of random faces or you see shoes. And then you get seen the faces again. You say, have you seen this face before or not? And so if you get distracted by the shoes, it's relatively easy to do the task, whereas if you get distracted by the random faces, it's really hard to do the task. And so that's what changed from before to after the semester, was that they're better able to say no and just sort of ignore the unimportant faces and stay on task and remember what they're supposed to pay attention to. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a then he gains more activeness in the other areas.
Right.
So in a case of a normal person who has got all the sensory perception already intact, who has nothing kind of sort of a problem, so what kind of advantage does the person can attain after going through meditation?
Right. Okay. So a good friend of mine has done that, and if you're into EEG, it has to do with sensory gating. So because I can't regurgitate all the details, but the idea. So maybe part of the answer is this. So if you go blind, say, what happens is that a huge amount of cortex that's devoted to vision. But even in us normal people, or I shouldn't say normal, even in people who are not blind, there are some neurons back there that are devoted to the other senses, right? But there are not very many of them. And what happens is if you're not using that cortex for vision, your brain doesn't just like turn off those neurons and not use them. And that's a lot of territory. So what happens is that basically those neurons things, and that's why you often have the enhanced be doing vision or doing sound and touch. Very loose. Jim's probably going to. And that's a very, very loose interpretation of what happens. But that's not what's happening here with the increased sensory perception. It's sort of like anything else. If you practice anything, you're going to get better at it, right? If you pay attention, and we know this with video games. The kids who do a lot of video games, you can actually show that their ability to pay attention has increased, right? And all it is anything you practice, you're going to get better at, and it just has to do with, again, I told you the neurons, they have lots of connections, and so how many connections they have, where those connections are going, and also just electrical properties of the cells change with practice. And so that's going to make them more efficient, more, again, less susceptible to other things. And just, so that's basically what's happening. It has to do with the gating. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Has all this science affected the way you guide yourself in meditation practice?
Yes and no. So the question was, has it changed the way I practice? So not so much how I practice, I would say. I'm also often thinking about the science, but I'd be thinking about something. I tend to think about the science. What has really changed my practice is actually the best thing about doing this work is that I get to meet some really cool people who've been practicing for years, right? And so particularly when I first started, I was pretty new. A lot of yoga, but I hadn't done much meditation. And my first study, I had some people who'd gone on multiple 3-month retreats. A person who'd gone on like a 6-month retreat. So people have been practicing 15, 20 years. And so that was really profound, like getting to talk to them. And it's kind of fun because usually people don't talk about their meditation experience, but somehow because I was studying their brains, so they opened up and they told me all sorts of stuff about their practice. So that really, really impacted how I practice because I got to sort of see from these people. So that I'd say had a much bigger impact on me than the science. But what a lot of people have told me, a lot of long-term practitioners have told me, is they say, they see this and it inspires them to practice more, which I find very gratifying. Or so that's I think, and also sometimes they have doubts. Is this really doing anything to me? And I'm sitting, and it's not a very good sit. It's an okay sit, but it's not very good. And why do I continue doing this? And so this sort of suggests that because there are some correlations with practice, so it does, I think, inspire people to practice more. So, at least for me, it hasn't really changed how I practice. So,
I know you said we don't have enough scientific evidence to say best practice is. What is the
And then, so what's the
current research that's going on? What percentage is looking at techniques?
Right. Okay. So there's a lot of people now. So there's a lot. So I would say most clinical research is with MBSR in terms of. There have been studies now saying MBSR for this disease and MBSR for that disease, and so there's a lot of that. And I don't know. It varies by disease. Who's doing what. In terms of the brain imaging, there's good, which is excellent. Most of the brain imaging is with Vipassana or Tibetan meditation. You see Richie Davidson's group. So all the pictures of the monks with all the EEG electrodes, that's done up in Wisconsin. And so they're probably, in terms of the EEG, they're by far, I'd say, the best. And that's, and I don't know. Josh, so she's the one who did the study at UPenn, Miami. There's some really nice work, and then there's a couple of groups at Stanford. They're doing some really nice work. No, but we're doing some bipolar. Well, we were doing some bipolar. We did a pilot study with bipolar. So, okay, that's the question, though. So, the question I often get is there anyone who should not practice? Schizophrenia, bipolar, PTSD, and basically anyone who's at risk of having a psychotic breakdown. I won't say they shouldn't practice, but they should proceed with great caution and under very close good meditation teacher or yoga teacher and by a really good mental health professional. Because what happens is that, and this is well known, like people who go on long-term meditation retreats sometimes spontaneously have a psychotic break. These are people who, for all intents and purposes seem normal and, they've never had any problems before, but it's rare. It's like less than 1 in 1,000 people. I think we figured out it's like 1 in 10,000 people, but on long-term retreats. And then recently someone's gone in and talked to those people, and most of those people have, although they're fine and normal, a lot had some sort of serious trauma in their background. So maybe they weren't PTSD, but they had some sort of trauma in their background, or they have a family history of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So there is this very, very, very small chance of something negative happening. And so for people who are already at risk for these things, it's probably best if, and so for them, I would definitely say start with 5 minutes, slow, real slow.
Would you recommend it in a clinical context, even at the risk of psychotic break because of the benefits?
Right. Again, so for instance, I've been talking a lot recently with some people who do a lot of yoga with PTSD. And what they usually do is they make sure the person is in a good place first. Like if the person's in the middle of the breakdown, you don't want to get right. So, but once you give them to a certain place clinically where the person's fairly stable and they're ready and they sort of know and they have some sort of tools to deal with this stuff. Because what happens is, because often it's really fast. What a lot of people say is even after like 3 or 4 sessions of yoga, the person has these old memories come up or they see things in a new way. And so the person has to be ready, because otherwise if you have a big trauma in your background, you can be re-traumatized by it if you're not ready for it, because all of a sudden out of the blue you'll just get the flash. And this happens to everybody. Like I don't have any serious trauma in my background, but I remember one of the first times I was sitting, out of the something that happened 20 years before, 4th grade on the playground again, this huge fight with a bunch of people. And, I never thought of it since then. But then all of a sudden, it was like, where did that come from? Talking to other people, they say, yeah, it's really common. When you first start studying this, all these old memories come up. And again, I didn't have anything in my background that was that traumatic. But if I had something big, that would have just happened. I wouldn't have been ready for it. So yeah, that's why, you really want to do a lot of work with them. And find people who've done work with these patients before, so they can sort of tell. 'Cause I can't tell you what the clinically what they have to be, where they have to be before they're ready to do the yoga and meditation. But Bessel van der Kolk, he's at the Trauma Center in Clive, Massachusetts. They've done a lot of work on this, and so they kind of know. At least with PTSD, I don't know about schizophrenia and the other things, but basically, there's certain places they have to be before they're ready for this sort of stuff. Van der Kolk. Kolk. So,
In terms of this type of research, is funding available and is it significant?
Could always use more. So NIH is the major funding source for all biomedical research, and there are 29 different centers within NIH, and the smallest one is the Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine. So. And they do not just meditation, but also acupuncture and herbs and everything. So definitely there's some money for it. And there's a couple small foundations and whatnot. But so definitely there's some, but yeah, we can always use more if you happen to know someone.
Has there been any research involving cancer and meditation?
Yes, yeah. So there's been a lot of stuff with root cancer. And actually, National Cancer Institute actually has more money for CAM research than NCAM does. Or they spend more than they do. So it seems to be highly effective for reducing stress, and a lot of cancer patients love it. I don't know. I think there's been a couple of cancer-specific biomarkers that have been shown to change, but not as many as we think we would like to see. And so, but I don't know all the research. I think for prostate cancer, I think it PSA doubling times changed. That's when I don't follow that research, so I don't know. People need to leave. Feel free to leave. So, and I can stay and talk for people too. So,
There
OCD. Yes. So all the anxiety disorders, I think there's been at least a little research. I don't know the OCD research. I think it's more yoga than meditation. One problem you have to worry about with OCD is that the meditation, the yoga can become the obsession and the compulsion. Yeah. And so they can, practice, and if it's not really clear, they're really practicing. So, yeah. Yeah. So, again, lots of supervision.
I've got a sort of frontiers of research for you. You know, most of the studies, at least that I'm familiar with, are about what are its effects here, what its effects, what length, what type, what style, etc. Sort of all external to what's going on inside the mind.
Right.
Do you see us anytime soon being able to really research what's going on inside?
Right. So when you're actually meditating, well, I mean, I showed you that a little bit, like the decreased amygdala and the increase in the mind-body.
I'm talking about the experience.
Oh, the experience. That's hard. That's really hard. The one study that was sort of like that, this again is the EEG electrodes on them. They had them in real time rate, because in the Tibetan tradition, they actually do a lot of reporting on their experience. Like, so if you practice in the Tibetan tradition and you go to your teacher, he'll say, okay, was it, how vivid was it? And they have very precise language to describe their experiences. And so those researchers, they hooked up the electrodes, and then they had them with a joystick, just in real time, sort of rate like on a 1 to 10 scale, how vivid their experience was. And what they showed is that, for like half of the subjects, they were, because Tibetans, they're not used to, because they're Tibetan monks, they sit up in caves, so they're not used to playing with joysticks, right? And so some of them, like, there wasn't very good data, but for a couple of them, they were able to, and basically in real time, that their EEG patterns really nicely correlated with what they were self-reporting. So that's probably the closest we've gotten to that. And there's another guy, the guy at Yale, he's now doing real-time biofeedback in the MRI scanner. And he's giving people their PCC activity. And what they're saying is that, that their experience of the depth of the meditation is corresponding to the activity, or inversely with the activity in the PCC. So the better their meditation experience, the more that's getting turned off. And then he also brought in some novices. So he sort of taught them how to meditate for like 5 minutes and put them in. And what one person said was, because he was there and he's sort of thinking about the rise and fall of his belly. He wasn't really feeling the rise and fall of his belly. And he couldn't get the balloon. He couldn't get he was looking bad and he couldn't figure it out. And then finally, through trial and error, he figured out, thinking about it, and we actually experienced it, that's when he got what he was trying to get. So in that case, it was useful. So that's probably closest to what you're getting at. But other than that, no. I mean...
I'm wondering whether, the technology, whether the sophistication of research methods will allow us to...
At this point in time, no. There's a lot of people who are very interested in that, especially the group up in Wisconsin. They're very, very, very in trying to talk to people. But again, it's really hard because, especially, again, in the Tibetan tradition, like the Tibetan monks, they are probably the best at reporting their experience. Because most people, if you ask them what they experienced, like especially in the Vipassana and other traditions, like they say, oh yeah, there was, but it's not, they don't use very precise language. And so it's really... So there's a lot of interest, but also just, so forgetting meditation, what is consciousness? You ask two people and then you're going to get very different answers. And there's not a really good understanding of what consciousness is or where it is or what, so I think, hopefully it'll help for that maybe. But again, I think there's not consciousness, I think and so sleep is one form, So if they can go into these different forms of consciousness, that might help some people doing these things. But at this point, nothing's been published yet, though. So, yeah. You guys are going. That's good.
I just got Susan sent me an app today that he found, and the heart map. And so you can wear some kind of device,
right?
And you can map whether
your heart rate variability. Yes.
Right, and so you can increase your mood or your state of well-being.
Right.
Is there anything like that going on in terms of meditation practice?
Right. So what heart math is, so for those, there's a little device. I believe it's someone told me it's on your ear, right? And you wear it on your ear, and all it's measuring is your heart rate, but not exactly. So what they've shown is that if you just measure, so most of us, we have about 60 beats per minute, right, of your heart. But if you actually look at the time between each heartbeat, it's not exactly the same, right? And so it varies between, I want to say, 600 and 1200 milliseconds, right? And it's actually, that's where the variability comes in. So the more variability there is, the better. And actually in little kids, you see extreme variability. Why? Actually, why is variability good? So if suddenly the fire alarm went off and we had to jump up out of our seats, if our heartbeat was always boom, 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 it would not be able to respond to those demands, right? Whereas if you need to jump up, and when you jump up, your heart needs to very quickly change in order to meet those demands. And little kids are constantly getting up and down, right? And so they have lots of variability. So variability is good. It's just very dynamic, very plastic, very elastic. And that, with stress, we get less variability. As we get older, we get less variability. And so, and apparently they've shown that, relaxed mood, you're going to get more variability than, right? So slow, deep breathing, though, will increase your variability. So there's been a couple studies with mostly like yogic breathing showing that yogic breathing greatly increases heart rate variability. Like it's through the roof, actually. Especially when you get down to about 6 breaths per minute. Your heart rate variability goes nuts. And why that's happening, we'll sort of know why that happens. Anyways, so that's pretty much it. And then there's some stuff with other types of meditation, but not as much as what they've done with heart math. So, yeah. Interesting concept. Yeah. And and so the idea, so we're starting to play with it a little bit, but sort of from the other point of view, because we've shown that heart predicts mortality, and so can we show changes in heart rate variability not during meditation, but just during rest? Like, so just sitting there doing nothing, how's your heart rate variability? Go through and be and then changes in health. So that's somebody studying that? We're hoping to if we can get some funding. Yeah. Cool. Ask questions, or should we let people go? Okay. And I can stay for a few more questions if people want to go, but thank you. You were on. This is fun. This is a great crowd. So. Cool. All right.
No, those were good questions. You had to keep going.
Oh, yeah.